The first panel is a review of the findings and a discussion with the panel members of the CCA report From Research to Reality, a report that was sponsored by the National Research Council of Canada. We're very grateful to the NRC for posing this question to the CCA. I mentioned at the outset that the CCA carries out assessments of evidence, answers questions that are put to it that are meant to be helpful to those who are asking them. And when the NRC came to us and posed this question, it was both a positive reflection on their interest in what we're doing and how the CCA can help them as they move forward with policy and decisions. So a very much appreciated thank you to the NRC. It's my pleasure to introduce Janet Rossant, who you heard from yesterday and by her own admission wears several hats over the course of today's and yesterday's symposium, as well as in the rest of her life. Her CV, of course, is as long as a Yellow Pages phone book. I'm showing my age by talking about a book, but Janet is both a national treasure in Canada and an internationally respected researcher in her own right. She's introduced herself as the president of the Gairdner Foundation, the chair of our current expert panel. She's also chief of research emeritus at CCA'S Research Institute, senior scientist, developmental stem cell biology program at CCA'S, and many other accolades. I do want to say another word about Janet. She has been just a stalwart supporter of CCA work. She previously chaired another of our expert panel reports on regenerative medicine. So she is one of the scientists that I think Canada and the world should most appreciate, who not only have done and do the science, but are giving back by talking about it and contributing to the public conversation. She'll be giving the findings of the CCA report. You'll also then, we'll return back and have a discussion with the panel. But you'll forgive me a moment of shameless self-promotion on behalf of CCA. You'll no doubt hear from Janet more about this, but I couldn't be prouder of our staff, our project director, Anita Melnick, who led this team to produce this report, and everyone back at our office. It really was an effort that not only produced under COVID-19 conditions, but we hope will be helpful. So with that, Janet, I'd like to turn it over to you to give an overview of the findings of the report. Janet.
Thank you, Eric. It is my pleasure to return to the podium, as it were, today to give you a brief summary of this report about the approval and use of somatic gene therapies in Canada. And this was, as Eric said, a charge that the CCA received from the National Research Council. And the charge was, what are the key legal, regulatory, ethical, social, and policy challenges specific to the approval and use of somatic gene and engineered cell therapies in Canada? There were two sub-questions that really were the focus of most of our discussion, I would say, during the preparation of this report, particularly around affordability and accessibility challenges, and then any promising approaches that we might find for overcoming these main challenges. And I will just start by saying, of course, that we've heard over the last few days and even in the last talk some of these issues and some of the approaches. So you're going to hear some repeats, I think, of things you've already heard. So first of all, who were we? This is the expert panel, and you'll meet the others at the end of this discussion. And they are myself, you've just been introduced to, Bill Charnetski, who is the Executive Vice President, Health Systems Solutions and Government Affairs at PointClickCare. He's a former Chief Health Innovation Strategy of the Government of Ontario. Ubaka Ogbogu is Associate Professor of Faculties of Law and Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of Alberta. And then finally, Harold Atkins, physician at the Ottawa Hospital and a scientist in the Ottawa Research Institute. We had an additional member who was Joan Castonguay from Quebec until January 2020, when she took up a new role as Health and Welfare Commissioner with the Quebec government, which meant that she could no longer continue on the panel, but we do and did appreciate her contributions as well. So that's the panel. How did we do our report? As Eric said, we were incredibly supported by the team from CCA. We used our own expert knowledge, such as it is. The team at CCA reviewed the literature and as much as they could, published Anne Gray literature. We had an expert workshop shown here. We had expert interviews, and the whole report was peer-reviewed by additional experts. But at the end of the day, the committee stands by the findings of the report. So why this report now? Well, there are 4 genetic therapies already approved in Canada, and there are lots more in the pipeline, as you've already heard. And this is a growing area. It's a very successful area. Gene therapy, with the addition of CRISPR gene editing, we're seeing an immense opportunity to develop new transformative therapies for a number of rare diseases, and also transformative cell therapies for cancer and other diseases. It's not only in gene therapy that we're seeing this expansion of transformative therapies. There's a lot of innovative regenerative medicine and other drug therapies coming to the horizon. So there's an immense growth in these new therapies. It's great to treat devastating diseases, but as we know, cost, accessibility, and other issues raise challenges. So, the scope of the report, we should point out, we are only talking about somatic gene therapies that's given to patients. We're talking about approval and use, not how they're made or the discovery science, though it's exciting. And we're talking about both in vivo and ex vivo therapies. Germline therapy is not under discussion, research is not under discussion, and non-medical applications of gene editing to agriculture, for example, are not part of our mandate. So what did we, when we say gene therapies, we included anything in which you introduce, remove, or change the genetic material, either DNA or RNA, in a cell of a patient to treat a disease. And they can be ex vivo, CAR T cells we heard about yesterday, or directly into the patient, like Luxturna for retinal disease, which we also heard about. So I'm going to try and very quickly summarize the overall findings. I suggest you, if you want more, you should read the report. But we really focused on 6 areas that we came to think were key to addressing this main issue of how do you implement, approve and implement these therapies in Canada. And so I'm going to go through each of those in turn. I'm going to start with the need for flexibility. And that comes down to this issue that what we're talking about here are a diverse range of different therapies. Some of them are absolutely novel and have never been tested in patients before. Some of them treat common diseases like cancer. Some of them treat rare diseases for which there is no other treatment. So developing clinical trials is tricky. Patient populations are small, the comparators are difficult. And when it goes through then to the regulators of Health Canada, they have to be able to respond flexibly. And so that's a key point, flexibility of regulation and regulatory environment. So what is the regulatory environment in Canada? 6 phases. First, once you've got your clinical trial and your clinical data, it goes to Health Canada and they consider whether it's safe and efficacious. And if it is, they will give it approval. At the same time, it goes through health technology assessment to ask whether it's cost effective. And this is where things get more complicated. And then, of course, we hit whether it will be funded in Canada, how it will be funded, how you manufacture it, and how you distribute it. Sounds like the vaccine, but it's true of any therapy. So the first part, Health Canada, as I say, approves on clinical trial results. There are CADH is the National Health Technology Assessment Panel. Quebec has its own INIS, and they do try to do this cost effectiveness. Is this treatment at this price going to produce a cost effective outcome? And then that plus the next phase of whether it actually gets funded is where there are challenges on many levels. There are uncertainties, finding number 2, with lots of uncertainties here. Uncertainties about long-term safety and efficacy of these novel treatments, we don't know. High price, it makes that HTA assessment very, very difficult. And as we've heard, in order to deal with that, we're seeing around the world and here innovative arrangements whereby there are risk-based purchasing agreements, post-market surveillance, real-world evidence that comes in later to mitigate the clinical uncertainties, to allow the regulators and HTA to actually say, yes, we will approve this and we think it should be funded. But this is a real challenge. Even if we get that approval by HTA and Health Canada, the high price, the complex provision, and the nature of the diseases really makes existing inequities in healthcare access a real issue as well. We're going to see, and we see already, that different provinces will approve different treatments. So some will be approved in some provinces and not in others, which means you have this terrible provincial variation in access. Complex delivery of many of these treatments means they can only be done in big centres, and that's already an issue, of course. Patients with rare diseases in remote communities are going to be challenged first to get access to diagnosis and to treatment. So availability and access is a big issue. And that sort of ties back to this whole issue, which we've already addressed, this issue of the value of a therapy. This is a different, very difficult topic, but it comes into the HTA, it comes into the funding decisions. And there are different ways of thinking about the value of publicly funding individual gene therapies. So for a system-wide approach, looking at the population, the system has to try to maximize health gains for the whole population at the lowest cost. And yet, what we're talking about here is for a few patients for each disease. These are very expensive treatments, but there are no alternate treatments at all. So how can you actually compare those two assessments of value, value for the individual versus value for the population? And there are no easy answers, and I would suggest that really you can't compare those. They're not comparable. And so we're seeing things like specific funding envelopes for rare disease therapies. As we just heard, that the federal government is looking into doing that. And I think you see other countries where there are specific pockets of money set aside for rare disease therapies. So you're not trying to compare the two, which is really, really difficult. So other things that we noted in the report was this concept of coordination. It's very important if we're looking at controlling spending and controlling access to gene therapies and novel therapies to have coordination across the country. And we know that we have multiple healthcare systems, and this is tricky. But there are some components already. The Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance does negotiate drug prices on behalf of a number of public drug plans together, which obviously improves their ability to really negotiate prices. The Patent Medicine Prices Review Board tries to put a federal oversight on making sure that medicines are not outrageously priced. But in the end of the day, it does come down to each province as to whether the public system will pay. So is a national pharmacare program a solution? And obviously that is also under consideration by the government and would allow more coordination across the whole top area. Protecting public investments came up as a discussion point under many headings. Stewardship of public investments in gene therapy. So a lot of the research that has gone on to develop these amazing new therapies has come about through investments in academia. And we heard that yesterday, coming out of academic centers, CAR T therapies, Luxturna, all these treatments where public investment has really started the process. They then go off into companies, and sometimes the companies then don't necessarily think of taking into account the public investment and the need to look at the public good. So there is an opportunity to try to protect public investments and make sure that the public good is also under discussion when you're negotiating the prices of these drugs. So those are the sort of 6 general areas. This is a brief survey. And then the committee had a final few reflections, I guess one should say. The challenges we're talking about here are global. I mean, everybody is struggling. There's a great excitement about transformative therapies, a great concern about how healthcare systems can really carry the burden of the cost in a reasonable manner while incentivizing, obviously, more research to undertake these kind of treatments for rare and important diseases. So those are global, and we can learn from global solutions. There are intrinsic Canadian things, mostly related to the interprovincial issues, and there are some emerging solutions, as we've talked about. But I think there's particularly an emerging solution the committee feels where we have strengths in Canada in cell manufacturing, in vector development, in gene therapy environments, obviously in clinical centers that can implement gene therapies, and networks like BioCanarex that can pull together centers across the country to develop new clinical trials in this area. So it is an opportunity for Canada. But we are all going to have to keep an eye on the ball because things are moving fast, new technologies will come into place, and we have to consider all the way through, not just the science, but also how to manage affordability and access. Then finally, I went past them. My thanks to the task force members, CCA staff, particularly workshop participants, peer reviewers, and all the others who gave important input. And thank you.
Well, Janet, thank you very much. As advertised, a brief overview of the findings from the panel. We're going to make it possible for people to ask questions. The line at the bottom of the screen shows you how to do that. And as people sort of put their ideas together, maybe just a couple of quick reactions and then have our panel start to join us. As you know, this was a report of an expert panel of the CCA, and what we do is we bring people together who, I should say, do this on a volunteer basis. It's one of the great joys and privileges to have expert panels, not just of smart people who wish to talk about their work, but who really dig in over a period of time to think about the evidence, to think about what information is needed, and to provide a starting point for the discussion. And to have Janet, Harry, Bill, and Ubaka agree to do this, plus a workshop that has been mentioned of another dozen people who took the time not only to work with us, but to put together this document is something that I know that Canada appreciates, the NRC appreciates, and I think the area of gene therapy and genomic science appreciates. As questions start to come in, if you have a question for one of the speakers, as it says, submit your question in the ask bar located below the viewer. In anticipation of warming you up, though, I actually have a few things that I've been considering myself, having watched this process. And I'm just maybe wondering, I'll start with Harry, if it's okay. And pose this maybe to some others, but recognizing that this is an evolving field, what should we be asking after Canada has a couple of years of experience with gene therapies? How should we be rolling this out and thinking about next steps? We've heard some exciting science, and we're really looking forward to this coming into the clinic, but what are the kinds of things we should be thinking about going down the road? Harry?
So from a health system point of view, Eric, I think it's really to get the infrastructure in place. And so we're learning how complex that is with some of our first forays using CAR T cells, for instance. And a different infrastructure needs to be put in place, different contracts, different pricing models, different training for access to commercial CAR therapies. But then if we have point of care manufacturing, where a patient might go to a center and the center does the manufacturing for the product for the patient, that's a whole other set of challenges and logistics. And so we need to start planning ahead and building the expertise in fields that we don't really have in our healthcare system right now. People who understand good manufacturing practices, legal advice to help sort out contracts, intellectual property, need to have people to help guide the patients and what the implications of these therapies are. And so these are, and then training so that physicians and nurses and others who provide this kind of training will be able to administer it properly and safely.
Over and Bill, ask you the same question from your perspective, because you've been monitoring and engaged in this for quite some time. are there things that we need to be paying particular attention to as we start to roll this out over the next few years, that sort of building on Harold's point there?
Yeah, I think I can capture my thoughts with a couple words, namely be realistic. As the pandemic has shown, at some point, sometimes realism just intervenes, and we'll see the result of a lot of decisions on kind of similarly situated products as the vaccines roll out over the next whatever number of months. So I think we really do have to be realistic. So what does that mean? I think one of the things that we struggle with, as I think everybody does, is notwithstanding that now hundreds of millions of dollars are flying around, there will be a harsh reality with respect to health expenditures in the country, which will highlight even further the cost issues. So while access is, of course, important, as Janet was highlighting, we can't ignore, as we're developing the capabilities that Harry's talked about, and as we're looking at some of the bigger issues, the fact that the questions will coming before us quickly, and they'll be tough questions. So they're going to be questions like, for a child with spina bifida, what is it the right investment for the health system to spend $2.5 million on a single person for a relatively marginal improvement of quality of life? So I say this, remote. If it were my parent, I know what I would answer. But as you look at it from a policy perspective, so I just think we got to be realistic, and we have to be prepared for tough conversations. And we can't think that 10 years from now is the first time we really get to have them in earnest, because these products are going to start coming at us quickly, and they'll each individually as well as in the aggregate have impact.
Interesting point. And Janet, I'm collecting questions that our team behind the scenes are putting together, and I just want to maybe close a loop on this issue of manufacturing. You did mention sort of what some of our capacity is in Canada. Cell manufacture was mentioned as an area of strength for Canada. And I know that in the previous report you did for CCA, talking about where Canada leads and what some of its strengths are. Can you maybe say a bit more about the strengths that we have in this area of science and clinical care? Where are the centers, for example, if you can even comment on that? Where are Canada's strengths?
Well, I think I would actually punt that one to Harry, because this is really very much in his area. I would point out that when I talk about cell manufacturing, that is something that can be used for things like CAR T therapies, but also in regenerative medicine. So now we also have heard in the news, of course, that we don't have enough manufacturing capacity for vaccines. That's probably true as well. But we're not talking about making millions of doses of vaccines here. We're talking about manufacturing cells to be given to patients, probably locally. And as Harry has often said, the concept of having sort of point of care cell manufacturing distributed across the country is a model that is basically what's happening in Canada now. Is there enough? I don't know. Do we need to train more people to be able to use those facilities successfully? We do have a personnel shortage, I think, trained personnel in that area. But I think that's the way I look at it. We have capacity across the country, but it's not on the sort of making a large scale. This would really support individual therapies being given to individual patients. Harry, is that a reasonable summary?
Yes, Janet. I think we're building capacity now. So we have capacity to build, for instance, viral therapies that we can give to maybe hundreds or perhaps a few thousand patients, and to grow that to a bigger scale for more common diseases. Well, we don't have that capacity, particularly in Canada, but you need to build the expertise in the centers we have right now to grow that to the next level as the new products come online. There's a rich environment of making cellular therapies more individualized, personalized medicines for patients. And there are initiatives in where these groups work together, things and come together in CellCan, BioCanRx, Stem Cell Network, that are really spearheading the introduction of these in early and mid-phase clinical trials, and work together to share best practices to train our newcomers to the field, and develop new technologies which can then be diffused throughout the country. And the centers exist in most provinces now.
Thanks, Harry. I want to turn over and maybe ask Ubaka to jump in on a different question. I think we talked about the manufacturing issues, but maybe from your perspective, Ubaka, you've been now on a couple of CCA panels, but this one was really focused on this topic of somatic and engineered cell therapy, an area of great interest for science, but also for law and ethics and policy. And I'm wondering whether you can even reflect on, were there any sort of challenging questions that you thought the panel addressed really well that are advancing the discussion? So we've heard about a manufacturing issue, we've heard about science, but we have this parallel question going on about how well suited we are to answering some of the tougher, challenging questions at that policy level. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I do think that one thing we really spent some time on was thinking about how to build a national coordinated policy strategy that addresses that is designed to address the uncertainties that Janet talked about, but also is robust enough to do the things that a regulatory system would normally do, such as ensure that you have safe and effective therapies, which you approve and get through the system and to the clinic in as timely a manner as possible. And one of the things we talked about was this idea of a regulatory sandbox, which is the idea that perhaps an institution like Health Canada could lead a national conversation about using these therapies as they come online, as a testing ground, if you will, for how we regulate these therapies and move them through the regulatory pipeline and through the health technology assessment pipeline and the sort of pricing decisions in a way that's timely, in a way that produces sort of the best results in a manner that's coordinated and works for Canada as a whole. So the idea of regulatory sandbox as a testing ground for how you regulate these therapies and get them to the clinic is something that we really want to emphasize, because I think it's important as a way of sort of cutting down on the uncertainties and also being able to create a streamlined process that allows for decisions to be made in a robust manner and in a way that works for the country as a whole. So I think that's really one area of strength that we could focus on, and that will make the introduction of these therapies easier. The other thing too is how law can contribute to decisions around fairness and how we allocate funding to be able to support these therapies. One of the things that we wouldn't like to see, and we talked about this a bit on the panel, is that decisions are being made differently in different provinces, which then creates inequities and access issues in some provinces and not in others. You also don't want a situation where, patient groups, for example, or particular patients sort of advance their costs for the therapies, rightly so, but they're not able to gain access and government support while others do not. So I think there's some conversations that need to be had around fair allocation criteria and how you make decisions around what to support, where law and ethics can also be useful in thinking through that. And fortunately for us, we do have a COVID vaccine as an example of the kind of therapy that could come online and challenge our thinking around this. And I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons from how we allocate COVID vaccines that can be applied here as well.
Janet, I wonder if I could punt it over to you as well, because in fact, one of the questions that came online from the audience really referred back to, I think, Chris McCabe's presentation from yesterday. And for those who weren't here yesterday, Dr. McCabe was talking about the health technology assessment process, but also how cost and financial issues are assessed in some very challenging and not obvious ways. So, Janet, could you maybe reflect a little bit, wearing whether it's your Gairdner hat or your panel chair hat or your experienced scientist hat, about how these ideas of figuring out cost and access, how do we make sense of some of that?
Well, I'm not sure I have enough hats to be able to answer that question. It's clearly that it's the one that we keep coming back to, which is, how do you really value? What is the value of investment? And at an individual level, you showed the picture in the Ottawa Citizen this morning. There's a family discovering that their child has SMA, and that's a devastating diagnosis. And yet, at the same time, they're given hope because there is now a gene therapy, and they've actually been given access through the company to that gene therapy. So that's changing their lives and their child's life forever, potentially. I say potentially because, of course, again, these gene therapies should, we hope, work for a long, long time, but we don't know that. So I think there is this overall concept in all of these approvals everywhere that they come conditionally, that there is going to need to be an ongoing engagement with the companies that deliver that have the therapies and the patients and the payers, so that you can get what Chris called real-world evidence, so that there is an ongoing assessment of the success of those therapies. And then the system, the payer, and the regulators are going to learn from what is going on and coming back through those real-world assessments. We heard from Durhan that families are very keen to do that. I don't think there's any reason to suppose that patients who receive these therapies are going to say, thank you very much, I'm going away now. They will join registries. They will get involved in follow-up. And so I think this is where patient engagement, which really we need to mention more, patient and family engagement is really key. And it's going to help that real-world assessment that will provide value, measured value. But again, the other issue comes, are we still just pricing these too high? Is the whole system of pricing these therapies, does that need to be looked at again? And I think that's a much bigger question that perhaps is going to roll out over time as we look at the way that companies are really assessing their pricing.
Bill, I wonder if I can come back to you on that again, wearing the multiple hats. You've had worn hats within the Ontario government as Chief Innovation Strategist. You've got multiple perspectives here. I know the panel wrote a thin report. It wasn't 800 pages. It was a really important report that highlighted, not just for NRC, but for the rest of the country, how we are thinking about these things. But could you reflect on this same question? Because clearly in this report, unlike the discussion we'll be having later with the panel on looking towards the future, this report was focused on somatic and engineered cell therapies that have already made their way or have substantially made their way through the research process, and we're ready to get them, into patients, and we're finding that there are access and cost issues. How do we think about those things from wearing your multiple hats?
So first of all, I'd like to think of it as a concise report, Eric, not a thin report, but that's semantics. So I enjoyed this work because of the multiple hats. I mean, I've quite literally, I guess, sat on both sides of the table after spending 10 years in the global pharmaceutical industry and then 3 years as the Chief Health Innovation Strategist. So I didn't have responsibility for the drug plan, but I was obviously part of that conversation. And one of the themes I think we got right, and I hope those looking to the future will also, is the notion that it's very easy to vilify the global pharmaceutical industry. and that's my doorbell, a global pharmaceutical industry. But these are really smart and capable and passionate men and women. And in fact, the speed by which they brought vaccinations to the market already shows what they're capable of doing. On the other hand, the number of 2.5 million or 2.3 million or 1.5 million or whatever it is as the suggested cost for these therapies is not grounded in science, literally, but also metaphorically. We've set up a system, frankly, around the world where the industry gets to charge what the market will bear. And they're not bad people for doing it, but that's what they are doing. And I think it's incumbent upon us on the public side to find the true collaborative common interest space between public and private and get to a place where we actually can bring these therapies to market to help those in need. It's not to vilify global pharma and just, be on a constant attack mode, but it's also not to just take these suggestions as given that somehow they're grounded even in, frankly, financial analysis as opposed to like precise financial analysis, let alone science when they come up with a price. I would like to see us as public purchasers bring to bear to the market what we can. For example, in a country of 36 million people, what great purchasing power that would bring. And then maybe we get closer to a conversation where the public and the private are collaborating and working together.
I'll pivot back maybe to Ubaka on this because, of the findings that Janet presented on behalf of all of you, one of them I think speaks to this conversation we're having right now, and it relates to the idea of different conceptions of value, and that there may be, as you said it in the report, it may lead to disagreement over the merits of publicly funding individual gene therapies. In a sense, the good news is the panel wasn't recommending a direction that the government should go or how to resolve that set of disagreements. But maybe, Ubaka, I can start with you. Could you maybe flesh out what was sort of being discussed under that rubric of that finding, of how there are different conceptions of value and what the implications of that might mean? I think Bill sort of framed it very nicely as not everything is 2.5 million, but how did, and then maybe Harry, you can pop in after Ubaka.
So it's when you think about different conceptions of value, the idea is what should drive the decision to fund or provide a particular therapy, and obviously that question, depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers to that question. What people see as value will depend on how close they are to the therapy, how much what their views about what the therapy is going to do for them. If you think about payers, they're thinking about what the system can afford and the opportunity cost of providing therapy. For every therapy that's funded, there is going to be some therapy that's not funded, and the value that's going to derive from providing a therapy is it going to provide a cure, or is it going to provide something less? Is it an improvement of disease state? So this is a very vexed question, and one that does not have any easy answers. And as Bill suggested, I think one way through that thicket will be to first come to some reasonable understanding of what actually drives pricing and cost of these therapies. It cannot no longer be that it is driven solely by what the industry wants to achieve. I think Harry and Janet mentioned also the public investment in research needs to be accommodated within that idea. And I think once we get sort of a reasonable understanding of what actually drives the pricing that accommodates this sort of public and private aspects, and then we start to ask, okay, what exactly are we trying to achieve for the health system and for Canadians with these therapies? And I think one area that's really important to talk about is rare diseases, and that's something we haven't touched on yet. But it's important because this is a place where how we think of value is much different from how we think of maybe a therapy that's going to be widely available. And in the rare disease space, we're looking at, few patients, high prices, and there the opportunity cost is greater, and conceptions of value tend to be much more, like I said before, vexed. So I don't know if that's an answer, but it just sort of gives you an idea that it's a very difficult question to answer, and that has a lot of moving parts. But I think the key is to start from where Bill suggested, which is let's come to some reasonable understanding of what actually drives the pricing. And then we can start to talk about what conceptions of value should drive the decision as to whether to fund the therapy or not fund the therapy.
Yeah. Harry, I said I was teeing you up for your thoughts on the same question about this notion of different conceptions of value and how that might drive decision making. How, from your perspective, does this, I don't even know if it's fair to call it a disagreement, that may be simplifying. It's quite a complex set of considerations as you laid out in the report itself.
I do think that a better yardstick to measure value is going to be required, and that we can no longer just rely on the usual tool that HTA gives us, because there are too many nuances. And as the price of these new therapies go up, you're going to get competition between groups with different health needs. And how do we decide? Really, it comes down to what the values are that are felt to be important. And as Ubaka mentioned, it's, we don't know, are these going to be gene therapies? Are they going to be lifelong cures where, a young child will grow up and have a normal lifespan and a normal ability to fit into society? Or is it going to be a short-term treatment for cancer that provides a 10-year remission or a 2-year remission? Or, how many manifestations of disease are going to go away? And if we aren't honest and develop a framework to better evaluate these differences in outcomes, I think we're going to not be able to get to the root of the problem, which is the value that we want to pay for in healthcare.
It's sort of a fascinating conversation that we're having now, because later today there will be a panel that is looking to the future, and not just limited to somatic cell gene therapies, but a much larger perspective on the future. In fact, a quick shout out to Farah Kaiser, who's going to be live tweeting about this, the future of gene therapy panel. So, Janet, I wonder if I could come back to you. We've got about three minutes or so left in the session, and maybe just to reflect on how the particular focus of this report, how we should be thinking about its own limiting factors. It's talking about somatic gene therapy. It's talking about availability for patients now. We're not yet talking about some of the more challenging gene therapies down the road, or the gene editing technology that we heard a little bit about yesterday. But how do you see this report fitting into the larger conversation about the development of research, the development of science, development of therapy? Just maybe from your historical perspective, you've watched somatic cell therapy evolve from the time when it was quite controversial and we didn't know if it was a good idea, all the way to it's now working, and the problem is about access and payment and all of these technology assessment things. Can you give us a reflection? And then I'll let the others maybe do the same thing if we have time. Janet?
Yeah, so I think sitting on this panel actually, to me, has been quite informative, because, I'm a scientist, and scientists are always looking to the future. And we have a challenge. There's a rare disease. How do we treat it? People develop ways of doing it. It's fantastic. And we heard two great scientists yesterday talk about how they developed the science for CAR-T therapies and gene therapy for rare diseases. And you don't necessarily stop to think about how does this impact the healthcare system. So I think that this report is very timely because, as you've seen throughout our discussions, there may only be a few gene therapies coming forward now and a few transformative drug therapies. I think of cystic fibrosis, for example, where amazingly, finally, you get the gene and finally we have treatments that are based on understanding what the gene does and fixing it. So the Human Genome Project is finally coming into its own as identifying the genetic underpinning of diseases, and we're getting much better at developing therapies based on that genetic information. So it's incredibly exciting science. And now we have to think about, and now is the time to do it, really developing systems to be able to price these appropriately, whether that means working in both public and private domains. And it also means having really this ongoing discussion of how do we value the different kinds of therapies in our society. None of us have the answers. We had a lot of discussions, but I think this is just the beginning of an ongoing discussion that needs to be had.
I think we've got maybe time for another question or two. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left in our session. I'm just going back to the list of some of the questions that have come up from the audience and make sure we've given them a chance to hear from you as well. One of them is about Canada being such a small market, and I don't know that we have enough time to go into our purchasing power as a country. The report talks about 3 or 4 therapies that have come to market, but is the small market problem in Canada going to be a barrier? Maybe I'll ask Bill to give us 30 seconds on that, just to sort of reflect on it.
That's the world up in tiers, and you've got the US, of course, and you have the aggregate EU, and then, of course, you have China and Japan. So are we that size? Of course not. On the other hand, we shouldn't underestimate that we're a mid-sized market and we pay our bills. And I don't say that flippantly. I mean, and I suspect that going forward, as the future panel might think about, who knows what the global and individual national fiscal situations are really as we come out the other end of this. I mean, the numbers are astronomical, but you can rest assured that Canada will pay its bills. And we as a country should be leveraging that as well. So I don't think it's a barrier, but it's not, overall, we're not in a particularly advantageous situation because we're just not the size of the European Union, China, Japan, or the US.
Harry, I'll turn to you for a barrier question, and Ubaka, I'll come to you maybe at the end. Harry, what barriers do you see? We've talked about some of the challenges, but sometimes there may actually be impediments because of the nature of our situation here in Canada. Do you see any barriers, or at least the ones that we can't overcome?
I think that there are a few barriers. One is our geography, and certainly spreading. Our population is spread thin, and while there are centers that have high population density, providing access to patients who are far away from a big urban center is a challenge now. It's going to be a challenge and a barrier to access the more complex the therapy is. I think that the market, coming back to your market question, I think that's also an issue. We're mid-size, we're certainly not ever first in line for access to therapies. And I think that one way around that is to develop some of the pieces of the ecosystem here so that we have some sort of independence, or we contribute to a bigger worldwide effort so that we punch above our weight and maybe get access sooner. And I think that having 13 or 14 healthcare systems across the country is actually a major barrier. Ottawa, I work in Ottawa, that's on the border of Quebec and Ontario, and have different rules for different patients that come live 5 minutes apart because there's a border between them, and that really is a barrier to providing universal and equitable healthcare, and I think we need to try to deal with that as well.
Thanks, Harry. Ubaka, I'll give you 30 seconds just to sort of reflect on what's required to assure that the regulatory pathways that you talked about before aren't themselves barriers, things that we can do, just sort of point form. Quick thoughts on that?
Health Canada needs to lead the charge and really lead a national conversation to get every province involved, to get all the decision makers in all the provinces involved, and to get the people who make decisions involved, so that we can have a clear pathway that people can follow and that can ease all the barriers to getting this from approval stage to the market.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank Janet, Bill, Ubaka, Harry for both presenting the findings, discussing the work. I think it's been, obviously I'm biased, it's been a fantastic report that you delivered to CCA. I know the board and our scientific advisory committee appreciated, NRC I'm sure appreciated, and so does the rest of Canada. I want to thank you all, and I want to thank everyone else for observing this and writing in your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of them.